Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to Montgomery County's webinar on Data Centers 101. I will be your host and moderator for tonight. My name is Devi Ramkissoon. I am the Chief Sustainability Officer in Montgomery County. Before we get into the event, I am going to just set some goals and parameters for our call this evening. The goal of this webinar is to share an introduction to data centers for Montgomery County residents. We will present a high-level overview on data centers, but we will not be covering deeply technical details of the topics we are sharing tonight. I also want to share that this webinar is not intended to represent the county's stance on data centers. It is not intended to be a public statement in favor of or in opposition to data centers. We are simply offering this as an educational session for Onco residents. Before we get into the contents of this evening's presentation, I also want to share a definition of data centers that is being offered by, by our Planning Commission. And this definition reads that data centers are buildings that often resemble warehouses or office buildings that serve as a physical hub for the flow of digital information. They house network infrastructure such as computers and/or technical and/or telecommunications and related equipment, where information is stored, processed, and/or distributed, and where data flows continuously through fiber optic cables. They range greatly in size. Some are as small as 5,000 square feet, and others are as large as a few million square feet. A data center may include more than one building, in which case it may be described as a data center campus. Also, I wanted to highlight why Pennsylvania is a hub for this issue or this question around data centers. There are four core reasons that we've highlighted here on this slide of why Pennsylvania. One is that we have abundant energy and infrastructure in the state. We have lots of natural gas reserves, nuclear power plants, and other energy sources that are attractive to data centers, are often energy intensive, which you will learn about more during this presentation. We also have strong infrastructure networks for electricity transmission and natural gas lines. Secondly, we have an abundance of land and site availability in the state. Pennsylvania has a number of abandoned industrial sites and lots of rural areas with ample space for buildings and the types of campuses that data centers often request or require. There are, thirdly, a number of economic incentives and investments, including at the state and federal level, to attract data centers to our state and encourage data center development. In addition, there is regional clustering. Several major projects are concentrated in the Philadelphia area and nearby counties, creating a hub effect and reducing costs for new data centers coming on. Just a few other parameters about data centers in Pennsylvania and what makes this issue so unique within our state. Pennsylvania has what's called a fair share doctrine, which is a legal principle under the Municipalities Planning Code, or the MPC, that prevents municipalities from totally excluding legitimate land uses from their zoning districts unless there is a valid and non-arbitrary reason. This doctrine applies to industrial, commercial, and institutional uses that are not inherently objectionable, which includes data centers. State law and the MPC means that a township cannot outright ban data centers if there is a legitimate land use. And in Montgomery County, this means that our municipalities must designate some area within their boundaries for such facilities. For this reason, it is crucial that municipalities have the appropriate zoning ordinances in place, and our Planning Commission recommends a conditional use approach as the best way for municipalities to grapple with data center applications in a manner that maintains control over how a data center is designed and what standards it is expected to meet beyond more prevalent or traditional industrial uses. The Montgomery County Planning Commission, in partnership with the Chester County Planning Commission, put forward a data center ordinance guidance. And the link to this guidance, if you scan the QR code that appears on the screen here, you can find a link to the guidance and read through it in your own time as well. And there is a lot greater detail about ordinances and codes in that document. For now, I also wanted to share here a map of our state and the current data centers proposed and or pending across the state. You can see some of those applications sort of clustered in the southeast corner of the state. And again, this is why this issue is really important for us to understand in greater detail. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome our principal speaker for this evening, Sarah Friedman. Sarah is the co-founder of an organization called the Better Data Center Project. And if you bear with me for a minute, I'm going to stop sharing and share then her slides with all of you.
Awesome. I'm really excited to be here tonight. Thank you, Debbie. That was amazing. And yeah, excited to be here and talk about data centers. I am a Philadelphia native, so excited to see friends and fam in the chat. And yeah, thank you, Debbie, for making this possible. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, I mean, this is a 101, but this is also pretty technical. So we're really going to try to balance between some pretty technical information, trying to get it out in a simple way, and hopefully leaving some time for Q&A at the end. As a bit of a background, I'm here invited by Debbie, but I'm not speaking for Montgomery County in any way, and I'm not super familiar with the data center development that's happening in your county. Next slide, please. Great. So yeah, as we're going to talk about today, I'm going to tell a little bit about Better Data Center Project, how we got here, what we're doing, dive a little bit deeper into what data centers really are, share a little bit about what we're seeing in Pennsylvania in particular, and then deeper dive into some of the issues that folks have raised, either in Pennsylvania or other places, is wanting to hear more about, and hopefully leave some time for questions at the end if folks want to learn. Okay, so yeah, as Evie mentioned, I'm a co-founder of a group called the Better Data Center Project. We formed pretty much a year ago today as former federal workers that wish to continue federal service. And we saw with a lot of the capacity going away with the federal government layoffs and retirements, and then also seeing a new land use coming along that maybe communities were ill-prepared to deal with because it was so new. So we provide pro bono technical expertise to community groups and local governments and community members at the front lines of data center build out. We do not have a position on data centers ourselves, but we support communities in whatever position that they want to be. And one of the things that we really try to work to do is to provide good science and facts. This is a really fast evolving issue. And sometimes there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation on either side of the issue as folks kind of grapple with such a new, large, and unknown industry. So really excited to be here today. I'll say my colleague John is our Director of Research and Science, and it's his first week this week. So excited about that. All right, next slide, please. So this slide is just up here. I think this is really mostly to show the scale of data center development in this country. Again, we formed about a year ago. We are entirely word of mouth. We've never done advertising, and we get a huge amount of requests from communities. What is a data center? How can I engage? What is zoning? How can I deal with water? And I think that is really a testament to where this is happening and, kind of how, in a lot of ways, we're a bit ill-prepared for this moment. Um, and I think the slide also shows, I think we operate locally, but we operate nationally, so have a pretty good sense of the common trends across communities across the country, which I can speak to today. And then it really plays out differently in every location. And Pennsylvania, really because of its geography, the huge amount of fossil resources it has and a few other factors, like Devi mentioned, is in many ways ground zero for this work. So it looks the same and it also looks different. Next slide, please. Great. So I think Devi talked about this, but I think it's really important to understand that sometimes when we say data centers, we're talking about different things. Pennsylvania has already had quite a few data centers for quite a long time. They may look like warehouses. They may look like another building that you really haven't seen. I live in Los Angeles, and we have data centers that are inside big office buildings that we would never know are data centers. And they have existed amongst us for probably a few decades in some cases. And essentially, they hold computer servers, networking equipment, and cooling. And they deliver our internet, they store important information, and they do a number of things to kind of keep our cloud and our digital infrastructure alive and going. So I'm going to go through a few what they are because I think it's important to differentiate and then talk a little bit about what we're seeing in this moment. So I think the simplest one that we see is really just a single company running a pretty small set of servers. So in this area, like I'm sure Penn and Drexel run their own data centers, as does Comcast. So we've been seeing them living amongst them every day, probably not really noticing, and they're probably sort of minding their own business, just processing our data. And then I would say more recently, over like the past 5 to 10 years, as streaming has really taken off, we've seen co-location data centers, and those are quite a bit bigger, and they often house a few different customers. So they're a large warehouse with maybe like a separate area for Netflix, a separate area for Amazon, and a single operator, like some common names are Equinix, that just are sort of operating them more like an office building with a number of tenants in it that are kind of sharing the electricity and water, but have their own sections and areas. And companies like Netflix might do this just to kind of make sure they're using energy. They're not going to get, they're sort of protected. They're providing like fast streaming to you in an area near where you are. And again, I would say like we probably have lived amongst those us. They tend to be in certain areas, but we haven't been talking about them a ton. So the third is really what we've been talking about and reading about and watching and talking about today. And that's what we call hyperscale data centers. So those are pretty massive. So they could run on power running from high 500 megawatts to 1,000 or 1,500 megawatts. And put that in context, like that's the size of a city. And they're really large acres as well. So they could be the size of a city. So some examples, folks may have not seen all of these because they're in varying levels of construction, but in Bucks County and Falls Township, there's a really big Amazon data center that is in process to serve Anthropic. And that's, I think, on the site of a US Steel facility. So it's a pretty major industrial site that's been repurposed. Similarly, Homer City, which we can talk a little bit about today, which I think is like the largest coal plant in the country, now turning into the largest gas plant in the country. So they're really massive. They are powering cities, and in some cases, they're the size of that. So that's, I think, where a lot of the consternation is coming from. Next slide. So again, this is just really like at a very high level what we've been seeing across the country, and I'm sure what folks have been reading about and hearing about. Um, and this is just very high level. So the water use is in many places unknown, but it's going forward in places that already have water issues. So the scale of this new water withdrawal for data centers can really stress local water systems, be them in drought areas or not. And I think in today's world, water is just always an issue. The second is that they're really big. So, we don't, as a country, have a ton of just available open space. And these are tending to go in either rural or exurban areas. So they're usually a piece of land that's either been used for agriculture or it's important habitat, or it might have another current or future use like a park or another form of development. So taking that kind of amount of land out of production or future production can cause concerns. Um, the third trend I think is the most important. When we started the Better Data Center project a year ago, hyperscalers, Amazon, these big companies had really strong climate commitments. So they were going into areas, some of which didn't have great climate commitments, and they were using solar because of their commitments to renewable energy. And we were seeing them as a catalyst to greater clean energy build out. That is not the case today. They're almost all using fossil fuels. So the climate impact of this new use with a new focus on fossil fuels is really what has many people concerned. Then just kind of the scale of this build out of think about it while we're building the power for many cities all at the same time using sort of our existing power system, which might be aged and have blackouts and have some concerns to begin with, affects our prices of electricity bills, and then also how reliable and whether your system can run. And then another trend that I think is causing concerns is that these are tending to use a lot of on-site diesel for what they call backup power. Okay, so next slide, please. So again, this just like kind of goes into what's hyperscale. So I think a thing to think about is again, that's for AI. So, if you're kind of a person who's like, I'm not really sure how I feel about this. I want my Netflix to run. This is probably not running your Netflix. Your Netflix is okay. It might affect your Netflix, but this is really to either train AI models, which is a lot of what is happening today, like ChatGPT or Claude on Anthropic. They require a lot of data and training to improve and become better tools. And then also what's called inference, which is how they respond when you put in your ChatGPT question, how fast it can respond. And they require kind of different power supplies. Training, you might not really need power. You don't need it to necessarily be as quick. Whereas for the response, the company might want it to be really quick because if you don't get the question you need quick, you might go to another AI tool. And this is just the scale. This is Homer City. I think it's a rendering of what it will look like. But again, this is 3,200 acres, 4.4 gigawatts. I think that's three-quarters of Philly's power. If it were to power Philly, more than Pittsburgh, and it will be the largest fracked gas plant in the US. It's a conversion from a coal plant to fracked gas plant for data center. Next slide, please. Great. So these are sort of, I think the reason that this issue has become so paramount across the country is really we have two things happening at the same time. We have a really big new unknown land use that's using a lot of energy and power, and who knows where it's going to come from, and it's all changing. But we also have a social backdrop. And some of the things that are, I think, combining to make this moment, I think particularly important is we have federal deregulation. So we don't have a lot of the federal laws and environmental protections that we did about a year ago. And we also have a push amongst a number of states to streamline energy to get it online faster and to streamline data centers. And so both of those things basically mean you need a lot fewer permits or approvals to build something. And that also means that you kind of have less chances to say, like, I'm not sure how this is moving, or I want to think about this a little longer. Um, We also have a lot local governments who and state governments who are tending to generally they process land use. They are tending to have less staff. They received a lot of money from the federal government in some form, and that's going away. And they also are looking around and often not seeing a lot of other forms of big economic development come their way. So they're kind of less prepared for some of this. Then there are certain things over the last year with how this industry tends to operate that's impacting how communities are responding. So the first is that there's a really widespread use of non-disclosure agreements to shield basic project information. And this is something that I think is not uncommon with a big housing developer or other type of developer coming into your community. They might want to keep their name out of the public for competition, but the type of information that's being shielded is often, the amount of energy you will use or where it will come from. And that's information that, from a community perspective, it's pretty important to have. And so this is a change. Um, then the second thing is it's really unclear often like what company is doing what, and that's because these are really complex, high value transactions. So there could be one company that's acquiring the land and getting the permits, another company that's constructing it, another one, say Amazon, who's ultimately building it, but they may ultimately have the customer of, say, Anthropic. So again, this is not by its nature nefarious, but it makes it pretty hard to kind of figure out what's going on from a community perspective. And additionally, we have an overall trend, which is let's build these as fast as possible. And that is for a few reasons. One, a race with the US against other countries to try to like get to AI faster, and also a race between companies to get AI faster. So both of those races are tend to be things that can impede slow, meaningful, thoughtful community engagement. And so as a result, some of what we've seen, and again, this is national, this is like nothing to do with Pennsylvania in particular, is that community concerns are growing. And they're using land use tools like moratoriums, which is a pause for a project, which I think, as Debbie mentioned, probably doesn't work in Pennsylvania, and just saying, no, we're not interested in this use. Then the third trend, I think, is that this kind of they operate different from other land uses that you might have seen in a past, like a manufacturing plant that comes in and tends to create a lot of permanent jobs. So they don't tend to create a lot of long-term jobs. They do create a lot of really good high-paying construction jobs, which is awesome. Um, and they also we'll go into it, but they sometimes lead to increased electricity bills. So, but at the same time, most states are giving a subsidy to attract them. So, we're states are giving a subsidy to attract them, but they're not operating in the way that economic development might operate in the past, where you're getting a lot of jobs in return. Um, and then there's often really good local tax benefits, but they can really vary across um, communities and leverage and all those things. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So as I touched on, there are a lot of data centers because this is happening across the country. Whenever someone asks where there are data centers, it's kind of everywhere. There's no state that doesn't have a data center that's proposed, a lot of data centers. It's a bit of a Wild West situation, and they really are happening everywhere. On the other hand, they are also happening more in Pennsylvania. So I think right now Pennsylvania is the number two state for data center build out, second to Virginia, potentially Texas. Um, and that's really for the reasons Debbie mentioned. They're second in the nation for coal, nuclear, and gas. Um, there's fiber access, which makes it really good for infrastructure and for inference and all of those things. There's a lot of gas pipelines. And then it is a really strategic location on the kind of electric grid seaboard. And so what that means is that Pennsylvania is both a hub for this huge amount of data center build out and fossil fuel plants for these data centers, but also for fossil fuel plants to serve data centers in other parts of the Eastern Seaboard. Next slide, please. Great. So this is just kind of going into a little bit more. This is a map called Frac Tracker, and it's showing the proposed data centers in Pennsylvania. So yeah, so there's 1,000 nationally. There's 40 in Pennsylvania. I think that number varies. I think I've also seen like up to 65 of these big data centers. So that's really a lot. Like when you think about the energy and the acreage and the land use, that's pretty significant. 100 billion have of investment have been stated in Pennsylvania. And again, it's supercharging this like really massive gas build out in Pennsylvania. So there's huge announcements about huge gas hubs and new gas plants because Pennsylvania is really like well suited to both develop it and export it to the rest of the region to fuel AI. Next slide, please. This is a 101, but this is like I would just say one of the fun things as an energy nerd about this moment in time is that people are really like increasingly aware and talking about issues that once were like very far away. So one of them is what is called PJM. And PJM is, folks might have heard about it, it's the regional grid operator for essentially the entire Eastern Seaboard. So DC, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and they don't own power, they don't own transmission, but they kind of manage it. They're like a bit like the air traffic controller. So they say they essentially set the power prices. They figure out which projects are going to come on when from the power generation side and where transmission upgrades are needed. And those upgrades, those big investments are generally kind of spread out over everyone's bill with in all of these states. Um, and fun fact, it is regional, but it is also in Valley Forge. And I think started in Pico. Next slide, please. Great. So I think people are concerned that data centers use a lot of energy, and they do. So, as mentioned, they can use as much as a small city. So there's a data center in Wyoming that is supposed to use more energy than the entire rest of the state of Wyoming. There's a data center, proposed meta data center in Louisiana that's supposed to, be the size of Manhattan. So the scale of this energy really is that big. Um, and that's going to have really kind of just big impacts on how our energy is used and how much of it we need. And again, like in Pennsylvania, because you're in this grid of PJM, it's sort of ground zero for that because the data center energy use is really leading to could be a 7-time increase. Next slide, please. Um, cool. So I feel like I really make the same point over and over again, which is the power is coming from Pennsylvania. It is the second largest energy exporter, and in this very time where we're seeing kind of we had as of last year a decrease in energy demand over the last decade. Now we're seeing a big increase. That's coming from Pennsylvania in large part. So those are new gas plants. A lot of coal plants that had been shut down are now converting into large gas plants. We've seen nuclear plants coming back online, and some federal government has ordered certain power plants that would have retired because they were old or expensive or dirty to stay online, and that includes the Eddystone plant outside of Philly. So just to say, like, I feel like I've been a little doom and gloom, but we are the Better Data Center project, and there are generally like good ways to do these things, and they're all technologically possible and feasible. And one of them is you can operate a data center using renewables and storage, and that happens in many places. It did happen before this last year. And there's also a real opportunity for data centers to provide a real benefit to the grid. You could build new additive clean energy and transmission, and that can be really helpful to your own, reliability in your community. You now have a lot more energy. It's clean energy. You might have new transmission upgrades, so that could like kind of help your power stay on. So those are some major best practices. In the nuances, we kind of are talk about what is called at the Public Utility Commission having special tariffs that for big energy users that require them to do certain things like use clean energy, and that's been very active in Pennsylvania. Next slide. So I think this has been like the very exciting issue that's really gotten a lot of people's attention, which is the way that data centers can really impact our energy bills. And this became really newsworthy last summer because of an independent monitor of the grid operator, PJM, came out with some statements that by 2030, existing customers, so homes and businesses throughout this 13-state region, could see their bills rise by 60%. And there were a few things that led there. One, there's a really complicated thing called a capacity auction, which says how much energy you need and it was so high. And then they were looking at how much more energy would be needed to be built in this region. And when it's built, the energy and the transmission, those costs typically are spread over everyone's bill. And there was a huge amount, and most of that was really 97% was from data centers. Um, and the transmission costs again kind of get spread out. So this has caused a lot of political and social response from Governor Shapiro, from other governors, from others. We're like, we have to fix this situation. Power plants can't come online fast enough for people and for data centers, and these bills are out of control. And the backdrop to that really is people's bills are already really expensive. They already were seeing pretty big bill increases, and 1 in 5 people in Pennsylvania are having trouble paying their utility bills. So, this is not a kind of abstract problem. An increase by 60% could be the difference between someone being able to stay in their home or to choose between groceries or electricity, which is a choice that you don't want to have to make. So again, there's like great best practices for this. Developers can and should pay their full costs. I think that most of these companies probably would, but they're not operating as such right now. So I think there's a lot of political pressures in the state legislature and in different forms to really just get them to pay their costs. And I hope this is resolved soon. Next slide. So one of the things that's kind of come up as a way to address this big bill issue and the timeline, because it's really data centers often want power faster than they can be built, either because of the weight in this PJM grid or just because it takes a while to go through permitting, is something called bring your own power. And this is basically, hey, let's not really mess with the grid. Like, we won't put prices on existing customers. We're not going to build transmission that will make them pay for it by kind of saying, here's the power plan and here's how it would connect and serve our project. We'll just build our own power plant, and no one will have to pay for it, and we'll just kind of build it and figure it out. And that's attractive for a lot of reasons. It kind of makes things move faster. It doesn't affect you and I's electricity bills, which is super important. But in practice, most of this is also natural gas. So this is a picture of the XAI Elon Musk project in Memphis, where they just have these big mobile gas generators that they just park there. So they just run. It's hard to see from this, but this is pretty close to schools and homes in West Memphis. So I think that's just something to be aware of. Next slide. So a big issue that folks really are often concerned about is water. And it's just interesting because the water uses are in area in which there's a lot of different variable information. It's not really clear. Do they use a ton of water? Do they not use a ton of water? And that's because there isn't really great reporting on how much water is being used. But we do know that the traditional water use, which is really to like cool this really like hot servers and equipment, so it takes a lot of water to cool them, can be up to $5 million a day, 5 million gallons a day. There is a lot newer technology that can be really good from the water side, but it tends to take more energy. So you sometimes have a balance with you might be saving water for the cooling, but then using water if there's a new natural gas plant, which also uses a lot of water. So there's a real balance there. Um, and then another issue that I think is pretty important in Pennsylvania is this water that's used to cool the servers and chips and equipment then has chemicals in it. And, they're kind of pushed out and they might go into a watershed or river or stream. So it's really important to make sure that there's protections that it's kind of filtered, or else it could kind of go out and, contaminate important waterways. So I think again, like, I think this is an evolving field. I think there's some good best practices. I think increasing the reporting and transparency about water use will be really helpful to understand, is this a major issue? Is this something that can be worked through? And then requiring developers to really commit to using the best water conservation. So that might be a dry cooling and air cooling. And then putting in place really strong protections to ensure that there's not water contamination from the cooling waters. Next slide. Um, great. So this is an area that Better Data Center Project and John have done a lot of research on, which is diesel generators. So some of these data centers can have just hundreds of diesel generators on site. And these are a very weird looking thing. We have them down there, but they can be at a single site. They look like these train cars. And they basically are the reason they're there is to provide what's called backup generation. So if the power goes out or it's a little slow, the data center can then switch to backup generators, these diesel generators. And so often there's more diesel generators than you would really even need to operate a power plant. Um, and We can go to the next slide. But in practice, this can be very harmful because diesel generators are some of the worst air quality sources. So they can lead to lung cancer and asthma, and really some of our kind of more health impacts on vulnerable communities. So this is another area in which there's a trend going one direction. I think there's like a really opportunity to do better. But the trend we are seeing is huge amounts of diesel generators on site, and them sometimes not really just being backup power, but being actually run quite a lot. Um, and the scale of this can be really impactful. So in Virginia, which is really the epicenter of data center development in the country, they have enough permitted diesel generators to power 20 million houses just for data centers. Um, but Virginia only has 4 million houses. So this is 5 times as much power as homes and families in Virginia just for data centers. So I think that's a pretty wild stat of this scale. Um, but there's also some best practice technologies. So you can pretty easily do this with battery generators, or require generators that have like a pretty high standard. So they're not creating some of these chemicals like nitrogen and carbon monoxide that can be harmful. Next slide, please. Great. So I think I touched on this, like just really like what is one of the things that's kind of wild about this time is planners and communities are thinking about economic development in a specific way, and these just operate differently. So, but we're kind of used to trying to attract industries to our state versus others. So right now, 38 states provide a sales and use tax exemption for the value of the chips, servers, and equipment. And that is basically the value of the data center. So when we hear these stats like $3 billion investment from Amazon, or $1 billion, like maybe 2.8 of that is the servers and the equipments and all those things. So if you're giving a tax exemption for those, you're basically kind of attracting these data centers, and not always getting, maybe a proportional share back like you would with another industry. Um, and again, there's been some reporting from other states legislators that they've been, I think last year, lost between like $1 and $2 billion because of these exemptions. So Pennsylvania is one of these states that does have this sales, and it has an exemption for computer data equipment. And so what that means is if you create a certain number of jobs, like 20 to 45, and a certain amount of investment, you won't have to pay the taxes. And a lot of what we also see is there's other tax structures in place to really like attract new economic development to areas that may have been former industrial sites or really need new jobs. And that means that they are paying a lower local tax rate. And that's a trend that I think we're also seeing in Pennsylvania with some areas that were zoned industrial or former industrial to kind of attract the development. They're getting probably less local taxes too. So overall, again, I think this is like an opportunity, and there are many states, including Pennsylvania, are pushing to remove these state sales and tax exemptions to make sure their governments get their fair share. And we're starting to see those pass. And I think also a similar trend as communities kind of realize their value. These companies are coming to where they are for a reason. It's usually energy and infrastructure, and they should be getting a full taxation for that and knowing their own values. So we're seeing an increase in local governments that are negotiating for higher taxes. And then I think another best practice is just making sure like when chips and servers are replaced every 3 to 7 years. So wanting to make sure that that's taxed again. Next slide, please. So I think Debbie kind of touched on this. So I'm not going to go so into the weeds here. Um, but essentially, these are local government decisions for the most part. And so in Pennsylvania, that might be your township or your borough. And what makes it totally wild in Pennsylvania is there are a huge amount of townships and boroughs, more than any other state. So if you are trying to figure out how to impact data center development in your region or your county or you're part of a county, you might have to kind of track what's happening in like 10 to 20 different municipalities. So as Debbie mentioned, I think the four counties put together a really great model ordinance. And this is an opportunity for community members to kind of go and educate or have conversations with their bureaus or townships about getting those in place. But the process usually looks like some kind of zone change that's required for this new use. And that can look a few different ways. And I think we talk about that on the next slide. So yeah, so this is again, Pennsylvania is a very wild space, but basically the practice seems to be a data center developer will put some kind of application in, and to get its permits, it needs to get a zoning change because in almost all the cases there isn't existing zoning that says, okay, this is where data centers go, or this is like our design standards. We want data centers to be a certain height. So that change of what it could look like a zoning overlay or a change to the zoning code is sometimes when communities first hear about a data center. And that's an important, that's where we see a lot of the local engagement come down as they're kind of pushing for making sure that these move forward with a way that allows for public participation and strong standards. Um, and again, there's some things that are, I think, generally like across the country, folks are really finding more and more important to push for in the local process, limiting non-disclosure agreements, making sure Debbie talked about this, but that the data centers are a conditional use. So they're not just we're not just saying like, hey, go in every industrial area. And what this does is it gives kind of the public another opportunity to engage, to understand the project, to in address like kind of their concerns or needs. And then also I think just kind of aligning this with broader planning. Um, yeah, okay. I think that's mostly it. So there's a lot happening in this space. Um, Pennsylvania has, I think, 30 or had 30 plus bills. This is a trend that's really happening in every state. And some of the legislation is really interesting. Some of it is how can we make data center permitting faster? And some of it is how can we put greater safeguards in place, like a moratorium. Some of them are about giving stronger tax exemptions. Some of them are about removing the tax exemptions. So it's really interesting, but a good place to also, I think, engage for community members with your elected officials to kind of understand what you might want to see in this process. But just also flagging, one of the things that makes engagement in this space really difficult, in addition to the speed at which everything is moving, there's a lot of different places decisions are made. So the local zoning is where community members can really make their voice most heard in terms of your elected officials, and they're also like important decisions. But the Public Utilities Commission is where, really just some decisions about how costs, how what kind of energy will be used are happening, and that's important to engage in. PJM, who's going to pay. This is a really live issue for clearly good reason. And then we have the federal government who has issued a number of executive orders in AI that have to do with, again, kind of streamlining, trying to make it easier to permit data centers and energy for them. And they've put it forward a lot of other incentives as well. So it's happening in a number of different places. And I think there's great groups in Pennsylvania who are tracking different elements of that that are great to watch out for. And I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that presentation. We are going to move into the question and answer portion of our discussion today. And if anybody has any questions, you can please put them into the chat box, or let me know that way. That would be the best way. I will be reviewing and reading any of the questions that come in. So now is the best time to do that. So please, we'll give it a minute to see if any questions come in. Okay, I don't, and just a reminder for all attendees, the raise the hand feature is not necessarily available on this particular webinar. So if you have any questions, the chat box would be the best place to share them with us. Great. Well, I think, Sarah, that means that you did such an excellent job. Oh, there are a few questions that are coming in. I think one about local action. So the question is, uh, local action is the best option to ask for local model zoning ordinances. So um, I can I can start to address that. And Sarah, if you have any other comments, please feel free. As I mentioned, and as Sarah mentioned, this is an issue that will come down to municipalities. Our Planning Commission, in partnership with the Chester County Planning Commission, did issue a model ordinance guidance. I had linked to that earlier in this presentation, and this presentation is being recorded, so we can always send that around as well afterwards. But that would be one of the best approaches for municipalities to take in issuing a zoning ordinance on their own. And Sarah, if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is I think it's a very wild time and place, and but one of the very beautiful aspects of this is it's a real opportunity to get involved in local government and to kind of get involved in the practices. And I think that's the thing that we've seen that's been really impactful. And I haven't seen Upper Marion's ordinance, but I think, the model ordinance is great. I think there's probably some other ordinances out there, and I think there's some key things to get across, which is, making it a conditional use. And then there are limitations to what you can do in a local zoning ordinance. And, for example, off-site renewable energy where the power comes from or your rates like that kind of doesn't, unfortunately, isn't in your local control, but things like air public health and nuisance and noise are firmly in there. And I think there's opportunities for like some strong best practices. And I think the model ordinance is great. And I'd love to see Upper Marions.
Thank you, Sarah. There was a question about noise. You mentioned that. I know we didn't really touch upon noise in the presentation. Do you feel comfortable addressing a noise question, or is that too deep for this for
I
the
think
purposes of
I
this?
can go for it. So basically, noise ordinances have generally regulated using the dBA scale, which might not capture low frequency noise. But because this is an issue that people are really starting to have concerns about. It's not an issue that I've been super engaged with, but folks that have lived near crypto mining or data centers for a long time it's a major concern. So you're starting to see some municipalities propose regulating that low frequency noise pollution by requiring a different kind of measurement. So that's a DBC or DBZ measurement. But I think so Prince William County, Virginia has a pretty good proposal about that right now. And that county and Loudoun County, that's kind of like, as I mentioned, like the epicenter of data center development in country. So they've sort of been probably dealing with some of these issues and kind of seeing how they've worked out for a few years. It's a good place to look.
Thanks for that. There's a question in here about what kinds of actions have been taken at the municipality level. We did talk about the importance of municipal zoning ordinances. Do you have anything else to add to that question, Sarah?
I think there's some like really, so again, I think we're in this like exciting time for a local land use law. In part that's because there's not, we're seeing federal deregulation, state is hard to engage in. So it's a really, exciting time and I think people are getting kind of creative. So there's what can be done in the zoning ordinance for data centers and, how to kind of make sure those are most protective and create the most opportunity for public input. And then there are some things that can be kind of done by local ordinance, and I don't want to like say that you can do all these in Pennsylvania because I'm not sure. They're somewhat state by state, but um, in some states we're seeing new types of ordinance that just regulate like large users. So in Tucson, for example, there's like regulations for large water users and what any large water user coming into their community has to do in terms of water conservation. Similarly, like ordinance that just broadly might prohibit or limit use of non-disclosure agreements and require like local elected officials to not enter into those or to have certain things be transparent. Those are not data center specific, but they're sort of coming out of this time. And then one type of local ordinance that had been in effect, again, I'm not sure you can do this in Pennsylvania, is a community benefits ordinance. So it could require things for development over a certain size to, hire local workers or local contractors or enter into a community benefit agreement of a certain size with certain groups. So I think you're seeing like there's a lot of interesting things. There's also like ordinances around nuisance and how that's regulated that I have heard are moving in Pennsylvania. So I think there's a lot of things. There's also in a number of states, folks are passing local moratoriums. I think there's some question about that in Pennsylvania, whether that is, as Debbie mentioned, kind of some of the law around that makes it potentially more complicated. And just kind of like pausing as local governments kind of like work through what their positions will be and how these should be processed.
Thank you for that. The last question I'm seeing in the chat box is related to some of the economic benefits. Sarah, you did mention the issue around taxes, that there are often tax abatements for large hyperscale data centers. And I know that some of that will depend kind of state by state. But the question is, what are the economic benefits, including taxes, to counties, municipalities, and school districts? I know that, again, some of that will depend, but is there anything more around that that you would like to share around potential economic benefits?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is there's just a real disparity in because much of this is negotiated. So many local governments are granting pretty big subsidies to developers and others are not. So in Virginia, where I think one county in Virginia, like they don't even do property taxes anymore because they make so much money from data centers that people who live there don't have to pay their property taxes. Um, in other places, the municipalities are getting pretty low amount. Um, and basically, it kind of is around your leverage. The subsidy agreements are also often a public process. So that's something for community members to be aware of. Like that will have to go through public review also. So it's an important thing to track to make sure that your local government is getting their fair share.
Great. All right. I don't see any other questions. If you have anything else that you'd like to ask, now's the time. Um, Oh, I see one last question on here. Any suggestions or resources for getting more information on data centers?
FOIA. I'm not super familiar. I know I'm probably like not the best person for this with Pennsylvania's open records law or Sunshine Act. So that would be like one place to look. I think right now with the federal government, like a federal FOIA is sometimes difficult, but depending on your state law, I think it's an important opportunity to get information out.
Yeah, you had shared a really great tool. The map that you shared, I believe, was from a resource on data center applications. Do you mind repeating the name of that
Yeah,
site?
it's called Frac Tracker.
Okay, that sounds good. Hopefully that can be useful to kind of get started on where some of these applications are and where current data centers are, and being able to kind of dig more into what the agreements or what the proposals are looking like as well. Um, any organizations in the Philly area that have been effective in addressing data center development? Um, I'm not sure development on what side, but I think that just nationally, I know that the Better Data Center Project kind of works across all states. And you all have been a great resource to me in my work as well. Do you know of any other organizations that you can point folks to?
Yeah, I think Penn Future has been leading a lot of really great work in kind of both the land use side and really kind of also at PJM and the PUC. So they're like a really great data center resource. And then I think there's other groups, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Food and Water Watch, that have been pretty engaged.
That sounds good. They are good resources. They completely slipped my mind, but they are really good resources for on this issue. All right. Well, I think we are in our last minute, so I'm going to go ahead and close the questions for now. Sarah, I really appreciate you being with us and sharing all of your expertise in this space. You're a great resource to our community, and I really appreciate you supporting Montgomery County residents in this way. I also want to thank all of the folks that have joined us on this call this evening. I hope that this call was informative for you all and had good information as a starting point for understanding the data center issue. And with that, I will bid you all a good night and thank you again for joining us. Take
Thanks.
care.